The guitar cable unplugs with a soft click. Not yanked, not thrown, just disconnected, deliberately, quietly, like severing an artery without drama. The sound cuts through the studio the way silence cuts through noise. Sudden, absolute, undeniable. Kurt Cobain sets his acoustic guitar down on the floor, not against a stand, not leaning carefully, just down, flat on the carpet, face up, strings still vibrating faintly from the last chord he played. The reverb hangs in the air, then dies. He stands, walks toward the exit, doesn't look at anyone, doesn't say a word. 32 people in the room, session musicians adjusting mic stands, sound engineers behind the glass, MTV executives with clipboards, camera operators testing angles. Everyone stops, not because Kurt's leaving, because of how he's leaving. No anger, no explanation, just absence. The door closes behind him, a soft mechanical click. The room exhales collectively, but nobody speaks. Not yet. They're all waiting for someone else to break the silence first, to explain what just happened, to tell them whether this is a problem or just Kurt being Kurt. The producer stands near the mixing console. Alex Morrison, 38 years old, credits on 60 major music television productions. He's worked with everyone. Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Stone Temple Pilots. He knows how these sessions go. Artists get temperamental. You manage it, you redirect, you get the product. That's the job. But something about the way Kurt walked out feels different. Morrison can't name it, can't identify the specific quality that makes this moment different from the 100 other artist walkouts he's seen, but it's there, in the deliberateness, the quietness, the complete lack of performance in it. Sony Music Studios, New York City, November 18, 1993. Thursday afternoon bleeding into evening. Outside the windows, Manhattan is 7 stories below. All concrete and yellow cabs, and people who don't know MTV Unplugged is being rehearsed above their heads. Inside, the studio is carefully designed to look undesigned. Candles, flowers, vintage lamps, creating pools of warm light, oriental rugs layered over industrial carpet. The aesthetic of intimacy, manufactured in a room that costs $8,000 a day to rent. MTV Unplugged started as an experiment. Take artists known for electric power and strip them down. Acoustic instruments, intimate setting, raw emotion. The first season featured artists like Squeeze and Elliot Murphy. Nobody paid attention. Then Eric Clapton sat down with an acoustic guitar in 1992 and delivered Tears in Heaven. 16 million viewers. The format became a phenomenon. Every major artist wanted their unplugged moment. It became currency. Proof you could do more than just rock. Proof you had depth. By November 1993, MTV Unplugged is the most prestigious platform in music television. Artists fight for slots. Labels push for it. And Morrison has produced 12 episodes. Knows the formula. Knows what works. Intimate but polished. Vulnerable but controlled. Emotional but televisual. Give the audience enough rawness to feel authentic, but not so much it becomes uncomfortable. That's the balance. That's what makes it work. Nirvana arrived at noon. 5 hours before this moment. Kurt came in last. 20 minutes after everyone else. Walked through the door looking like he hadn't slept. Maybe he hadn't. Dark circles under his eyes. Skin pale. Almost grey. The green cardigan hanging off his frame like it's 3 sizes too big. He probably weighs 130 pounds. Maybe less. Christ saw him first. Said quietly, "You okay, man?" Kurt nodded. Didn't elaborate. Just set his guitar case down and lit a cigarette. His hands were shaking slightly. Not from nerves. From something else. Something chronic. Something he carries in his body all the time. Dave watched from behind the drum kit. Didn't say anything. Just watched. Concerned, but not hovering. The band has learned when to push and when to give Kurt space. This was a space moment. Morrison introduced himself. Warm handshake. Eye contact. Kurt, really excited about this. Unplugged's been wanting Nirvana since Nevermind. Dropped. This is going to be special. Kurt looked at him. Those pale blue-gray eyes. Said, "I hope so." Something in the way he said it made Morrison pause. Not hope like anticipation. Hope like doubt. Like he genuinely didn't know if this would work. Like he was already questioning the whole thing. But Morrison had a schedule, had a shot list, had a broadcast slot already sold to advertisers, so he kept moving. Explained the setup. the song order they were considering, the visual approach. Kurt listened without responding, just smoked his cigarette and nodded occasionally. The first run-through of About a Girl went fine, better than fine. Kurt's voice was quieter than Morrison expected, but the microphones picked it up. The intimacy was there, the emotion was real. Morrison felt good about it. This was going to work. They tried Come As You Are next. Halfway through, Kurt stopped playing. Just stopped. Let the last chord die. Sat there in silence. Morrison leaned into the talkback mic. Everything okay? Kurt didn't look up. Yeah, just need a minute. 5 minutes passed. Kurt sat motionless on the stool, cigarette burning down to the filter between his fingers. Everyone waited. Morrison checked his watch. Thought about the schedule, thought about suggesting they move on to another song, decided to wait. Eventually, Kurt started playing again. Finished the song, his voice even quieter than before. Morrison made a note to check the levels. Maybe add some compression, bring him forward in the mix. Then they started The Man Who Sold the World, the Bowie cover. Kurt had chosen it specifically, loved the song, loved what it said about identity and selling out and becoming someone you don't recognize. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Nirvana had become exactly what Kurt feared. Huge, commercial, unavoidable. Never mind, sold 10 million copies. Changed music, changed culture, changed Kurt's life in ways he never wanted. They ran through it twice. Kurt's delivery was haunting. Fragile, like the song might break him if he pushed too hard. Like he was confessing something instead of performing something. Morrison listened from the booth. It sounded incredible, but it also sounded small. And small doesn't always translate on television, doesn't always reach through the screen and grab people. That's when Morrison came down from the booth, crossed the studio floor. Kurt was sitting on the wooden stool, head down, cigarette burning between his fingers, ash, getting long. He wasn't smoking it, just holding it, watching it burn. Morrison approached carefully, friendly, collegial. These artists respect directness but hate being managed. It's a balance. Hey Kurt, sounding great, really great. Just thinking out loud here. What if we brought a little more energy to it? You know, just to make sure it translates on camera. Kurt didn't look up, took a drag of the cigarette. Exhausts slowly, says nothing. Morrison continued. He's used to filling silences. The acoustic thing is perfect. Love that. But maybe, smile a little, connect with the camera. Let people see you're enjoying it. The room got quiet, the kind of quiet that has texture, has weight. Kurt still didn't look up, just sat there, cigarette smoke rising past his face. His hair hung forward, dirty blonde, unwashed. He's wearing that green cardigan, loose and worn, over a t-shirt that says something nobody can read. Looks like something from a thrift store. Probably is. His fingernails are dirty. Not from lack of hygiene, from playing, from existing, from not caring about the things people like Morrison care about. Morrison felt the energy shift, recognized he might have miscalculated. I just mean this is MTV Unplugged. People are expecting a performance, something they can connect with. Kurt finally looked up. His eyes were pale blue, lighter than they look in photographs, almost gray in this light. There's something in them that Morrison couldn't read, not anger, not defiance. Something sadder, something that looked like resignation mixed with a kind of distant pain. Kurt said, very quietly, they should connect with the music. Morrison nodded, still friendly, still managing. Absolutely, and they will. I'm just saying, visually, if you could give us a little more. That's when Kurt unplugged the cable, set the guitar down, stood up, walked out. The door closed. Morrison stood there, hand half raised, sentence unfinished. The technical crew exchanged glances. Chris and Dave stayed perfectly still. Pat Smear looked at his own guitar like it might have answers. Nobody knew what to do. One of the MTV executives, a woman in her early 30s with expensive glasses and a tablet, walked over to Morrison, kept her voice low. Should we go after him? Morrison shook his head. Give him a minute, he'll come back. Are you sure? He's an artist. They need to feel like they have control. He'll make his point, cool down, come back. But Morrison's voice had uncertainty in it. Because usually when artists walk out, there's fire, there's noise, there's a pronouncement, something you can respond to, work with. Kurt gave them nothing, just silence and absence, and somehow that felt worse. Outside in the hallway, Kurt walked to the emergency exit stairwell, pushed through the heavy door. The concrete stairs were cold, institutional, the opposite of the carefully designed warmth inside. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. He sat down on the landing, lit another cigarette. His hands were still shaking. He wasn't angry. He was tired. So tired. Tired of being told to perform. Tired of people wanting him to be something other than what he was. Tired of the machinery of fame grinding against everything he believed about music, about art, about honesty. Smile more. How many times had he heard that? From photographers, from managers, from record executives, from people who thought his face was a product they could shape into something more marketable. They didn't understand that he wasn't being difficult. He just didn't know how to fake it. Didn't know how to smile when he didn't feel like smiling. Didn't know how to pretend this whole thing. The fame, the expectations, the performance wasn't slowly killing something inside him. He thought about walking, just leaving, getting a cab to the airport, flying back to Seattle, canceling the whole thing. MTV would be furious. The label would be furious. But at least he'd be honest. At least he wouldn't have to stand in front of cameras and pretend he was enjoying something he wasn't enjoying. But then he thought about the songs, about All Apologies and Pennyroyal Tea and Where Did You Sleep Last Night. Songs he actually wanted to play. Songs that meant something. Songs that didn't need him to smile or perform or be anything other than honest. He finished his cigarette, crushed it under his shoe, made a decision. 3 minutes. That's how long he was gone. But in those 3 minutes, the room inside changed. The session musicians checked their phones. The camera operators adjusted settings they'd already adjusted. The lighting designer made micro changes that didn't need making. Everyone was performing productivity to avoid acknowledging that nobody knew what was happening. Chris eventually stood. He's 6'7", takes up space even when he's trying not to. Walked over to Morrison. Look, man. Kurt's not like other people you've worked with. You can't just tell him to smile. That's not how this works. Morrison kept his voice level, professional. I'm not trying to change who he is. I'm trying to help this translate. That's my job. Your job is to record what we do, not to shape it into something else. It's television. Everything's shaped. Maybe that's the problem. Before Morrison could respond, the door opened. Kurt walked back in, same slow, deliberate pace. No hurry, no drama. He picked up his guitar, plugged the cable back in, sat on the stool, tuned the low E string, which had drifted slightly flat, took his time. The whole room watched. Nobody spoke. When the guitar was tuned, Kurt looked up, not at Morrison, at the room, at everyone. He said 4 words. His voice was quiet, but carried perfectly in the silence. This is the performance. 4 words. 13 syllables. 5 seconds to say them. But they landed like a physical thing, like something with mass and velocity. The sentence didn't end with a period. It ended with a fact, an absolute, a line drawn. Morrison opened his mouth, closed it. He suddenly understood that arguing would be pointless. Not because Kurt wouldn't listen, because Kurt had already made the only point that matters. This is who he is. This is what he does. Take it or don't, but don't ask him to be something else. The MTV executive with the tablet shifted her weight, looked at Morrison, waiting for his call. Morrison thought about the budget, the schedule, the broadcast slot already purchased, the promotional machine already in motion. He thought about calling the whole thing off, finding another artist, someone easier, someone who smiles. But he also thought about the footage they'd already shot, about the way Kurt sounded, about the fact that millions of people would watch this specifically because it's Kurt Cobain, because he doesn't smile, because he doesn't perform the way people expect, because he means it. Morrison nodded slowly. Okay, let's keep going. Kurt didn't acknowledge the response, just started playing. The opening chords of All Apologies. Quiet, fragile, honest, no smile, no performance energy, just the song, delivered like a confession, instead of entertainment. The room settled back into work, but something was different now. The engineers stopped trying to fix things that weren't broken. The camera operators stopped looking for dynamic angles. Everyone just let Kurt be Kurt, which is what they should have done from the beginning. During a break between songs, Pat Smear leaned over to Kurt, said quietly, "That was some ice-cold shit, man." Kurt lit another cigarette. "I just told him the truth. Most people can't handle the truth like that. Then they shouldn't ask questions." The rehearsal continued for another 3 hours. They worked through Jesus Doesn't Want Me for a Sunbeam, Plateau, Oh Me, each song stripped down, raw, delivered without any concession to what television usually demands. At some point, Morrison stopped thinking about television at all, started just listening, realized he was witnessing something rare, not a performance, a transmission. Kurt wasn't performing these songs, he was channeling them. There's a difference. Around 7 p.m., they reached Where Did You Sleep Last Night, the lead belly cover, Kurt's favorite. He'd been singing it for years, long before Nirvana was Nirvana. The song is about betrayal, violence, mystery, about a woman who won't say where she slept, about jealousy and murder and the kind of darkness that lives in old American folk songs. But Kurt started playing. His voice was different on this one, rather, more desperate. By the final verse, he was shredding his vocal cords, not performing intensity, actually feeling it. His face contorted, eyes squeezed shut. When he hit the final line, I would shiver the whole night through. His voice cracked, broke, became something beyond singing, became a scream wrapped in a whisper. He finished, opened his eyes, looked directly into the camera for the first time all night, for maybe 3 seconds. His face showed nothing, no emotion, no performance, just exhaustion, just truth. Then he looked away. The room was silent. Someone in the back was crying, one of the camera operators, a woman in her 20s, who came to work expecting a normal session. Instead got this. Got Kurt Cobain bleeding into a microphone. Morrison sat in the booth. His hands were shaking. He'd been in this business for 15 years, had recorded hundreds of artists, but he'd never seen anything like that. Never seen someone give that much of themselves without any safety net, without any performance to hide behind. When they finished for the night, Morrison approached Kurt again, more carefully this time. "Hey, sorry about earlier, I was thinking about the wrong things." Kurt looked at him, that same pale blue-gray gaze. "It's okay, you were doing your job. My job is to capture what you do, not to change it. Most people don't understand that." Morrison hesitated, then asked, "Why is it so important to you, the not performing thing?" Kurt took a long drag of his cigarette, thought about it, finally said, "Because the minute I start performing, I stop meaning it, and if I don't mean it, what's the point?" Morrison nodded, didn't have a response, didn't need one. The band packed up. Kurt moved slowly, methodically, unplugged cables, wiped down his guitar, put it back in the case. Dave and Chris waited by the door. They'd been through this before, the post-session exhaustion, the emotional hangover. Kurt always needed time to come back from wherever the music took him. On the way out, Kurt stopped, turned back to Morrison, said, "Thank you for letting me do it my way." Morrison felt something catch in his throat. "Thank you for showing me what that looks like." 2 weeks later, MTV Unplugged in New York aired. 73 minutes, 14 songs. Kurt never smiled, never engaged the camera directly, never gave the audience the performance energy Morrison originally asked for. Just sat there, hunched over his guitar, singing like he was alone in his living room. The ratings were massive, not just massive, historic, the highest-rated Unplugged episode ever broadcast. Critics called it transcendent, heartbreaking, one of the greatest live performances in rock history. They wrote about Kurt's vulnerability, his honesty, the way he refused to give anyone anything except the truth. 5 months later, Kurt was dead. Suicide, Lake Washington Boulevard, April 5, 1994, 27 years old. The Unplugged recording became his eulogy. The album sold 5 million copies, wins a Grammy, became the thing people pointed to when they wanted to understand who Kurt Cobain was. Not the loud, angry songs, the quiet ones, the honest ones. Years later, Morrison gave an interview about that night, about the rehearsal, about those 4 words. The interviewer asked why that moment stuck with him. Morrison thought for a long time. Because he was right. That was the performance. Everything he did. The silence. The refusal to fake it. The willingness to walk away rather than compromise. Most people perform their whole lives. Kurt just existed, and somehow that was more powerful than any performance could be. The interviewer asked if Morrison regretted telling Kurt to smile every day. "But I'm also grateful," he said. "No. Because if he'd listened to me, we would have gotten something safer, something less real, and the world would have lost something irreplaceable." The session musicians from that night still talk about it, about the way the room felt, about Kurt's presence, about the fact that he made everyone around him more honest just by being incapable of dishonesty himself. Dave Grohl said in an interview years later, Kurt didn't know how to be anything except exactly who he was. Most people think that's easy. It's the hardest thing in the world, because the world wants you to be something else, something comfortable, something that fits. Kurt never fit, never tried to, and that cost him everything. But it also gave us something we'll never get again. Pat Smear, when asked about that rehearsal, just shook his head. Man walked out of the room without saying a word, came back, said 4 words, changed the whole energy. That's not normal, that's not something you learn, that's just who he was. The MTV Unplugged performance became Kurt's final artistic statement. The last time the public saw him alive on television, and in that performance, you can see everything. The sensitivity, the refusal to perform, the insistence on meaning over spectacle, the willingness to be small and quiet and sad instead of big and loud and entertaining. Morrison keeps a photograph from that night on his office wall. Kurt on the stool, guitar in his hands, head down, not smiling, looking exactly like himself. Below it, written in Morrison's handwriting, 4 words. This is the performance. And every time Morrison works with a new artist, every time someone asks him what makes a great session, he thinks about that moment. About Kurt unplugging his guitar, about those 3 minutes of silence, about 4 words that changed everything. Because that's what truth does. It doesn't need volume, doesn't need spectacle, doesn't need a smile. It just needs to exist. And Kurt Cobain existed more honestly in that room than most people exist in their entire lives. The world asked him to perform. He refused. Instead, he gave them something rarer, himself, completely, without apology, without compromise, without a smile. And 28 years later, people still talk about it, still watch it, still cry during "Where Did You Sleep Last Night?" Still understand that they witnessed something that can't be repeated, can't be manufactured, can't be shaped into what television usually demands. They witnessed Kurt Cobain, and that was always enough.